Here are 10 mistakes you want to avoid when incubating chicken eggs. And they're in no particular order. Some are more obvious than others, but those are the ones that we've come across and some of the mistakes that we've actually made ourselves. So let's start with number one, and that is maintaining an incorrect temperature. That's fairly obvious. You want to make sure that when you incubate eggs, they remain at a constant temperature, as constant as possible. And for chicken eggs, that's around 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit or 37.5 degrees Celsius. And you want to make sure that remains relatively constant. Fluctuations in those temperatures can lead to poor outcomes or maybe your eggs not hatching at all. The second, closely related to temperature, is humidity. Humidity levels are crucial and very depending on the type of egg you want to incubate. But too low or too high humidity can lead to poor hatching rates by causing too much or too little evaporation from the egg. The egg breathes, it has pores and there is liquid inside. And so you want to maintain the appropriate humidity levels so that there is enough liquid in the egg, not too little, not too much, to ensure optimal outcomes. The third one, improper turning. Eggs need to be turned regularly to prevent the embryo from sticking to the shell and to ensure even heat distribution. So not turning the eggs often enough or at the right intervals is a common error. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to go with an automatic incubator. I think Borodo is the name. It's an Italian brand that we got from Premier One Supplies. And that automates everything. It turns the eggs, on a regular basis, very slowly over time. I think once an hour they get turned, side to side. It has automatic temperature control, so we don't have to worry about that. And it also has humidity control. So there is actually a secondary pump, humidifier, if you will, that pumps in water into the base of the incubator so it can evaporate and maintain proper humidity levels. Now, there are a couple of issues associated with that automatic humidity maintenance. We'll talk about in a second, but that's the best and the easiest way and the most foolproof way of incubating your eggs if you remove user error from the equation. Poor ventilation is another thing. Some people think that, the eggs need to be warm, especially if it's a DIY incubator and, they cover it maybe in blankets or what have you, but that can really reduce ventilation. And poor ventilation is another issue that can prevent the embryos from developing properly, because eggs need oxygen to develop properly and expel carbon dioxide. So in other words, the egg really breathes through its pores, and you want to make sure there is enough oxygen inside of your incubator and that the CO2 gets out, and so the egg, develops appropriately. And so ventilation is incredibly important, and if you have insufficient ventilation, it can lead to high mortality rates, and you don't want that. Number 5, and that's kind of gets into, what happens even before you start incubating, is to pick the right eggs for incubation. Not all the eggs are good for incubate. Dirty eggs, obviously, you don't want to have anything that's dirty, that's maybe, contaminated with fecal matter or whatever, because the incubator, the inside of the incubator, is a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. And so if you introduce bacteria into the incubator, that can lead then to infection and to, the hatched chicks dying prematurely if they get exposed to those pathogens that they might not be able to fend off. So clean eggs is important. It's also important not to clean your eggs. So don't wash your eggs before incubating them, because that removes that almost invisible membrane around the egg that protects the inside, that protects potential pathogens from getting into the egg prematurely. So you don't want to wash them. You want to start with clean eggs that are well-shaped, that don't have any cracks, no elongated eggs, no super large eggs, which might have 2 egg yolks inside, not incredibly small eggs. So just regular sized for the type of hen that you're, incubating the eggs from. Clean, well-shaped, not super porous looking, not funky looking eggshell. So just a good looking egg. Those are the ones you want to use. You also want to make sure you wait or you store the eggs that you want to incubate appropriately before putting them into the incubator, So what that means is that I would recommend, depending on what time of the year it is when you want to start incubating, to go and collect eggs several times a day to prevent them from getting too cold, especially if it's early spring or, winter, God forbid. You want to collect your eggs frequently, store them inside, room temperature around 70 degrees Fahrenheit or so. Make sure the tip is down, the narrower side of the egg is facing down, and you want to keep them there for approximately 2 days. So you don't want to incubate fresh eggs that were just laid but also not super old eggs. So eggs older than 5, 6, 7 days, I would also not incubate. Somewhere around the 2 to 3, 4 day mark appears to be a sweet spot. We incubated all of our eggs when they were 48 hours old. So we kept them inside for 48 hours before putting them into the incubator. Some of the eggs may have been a little bit older, like a day older or so, but that's fine. So that's important even before you start the incubation process. Now, the next important factor is, incorrect calibration of the equipment or malfunction potentially. And we have, especially if your incubator is equipped with a thermometer and a hygrometer, you want to make sure they are calibrated correctly and have the right reading so they don't over-adjust or under-adjust the temperature or the humidity. So that can cause issues, and ideally you want to have them calibrated every so often, or you at least want to double check maybe with an external thermometer before you use the incubator to make sure the levels that it shows on the display are actually what's happening on the inside. Now, one caveat to that is when it's depending on the ambient temperature in the room you're incubating and the humidity levels, your incubator might have a hard time evaporating enough water to maintain proper humidity levels on the inside. So that's, when we incubated, outside temperatures were still sometimes going close to the freezing point, and we typically maintain our home at night in particular around 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Now that's getting pretty cold for an incubator, because if the ambient air is so cold in the room, it can have a hard time evaporating the water, which typically sits on the bottom of the incubator and then leads to reduced humidity levels inside of the incubator. So we actually had to keep the heat on higher, as we usually do, to make sure our ambient temperature is somewhere around 68 to 70, which is super warm for us at night, to make sure that enough water gets evaporated to maintain appropriate humidity levels. Because if you don't, in our case, our incubator comes with a pump and a humidity sensor, and it keeps pumping water inside to raise the humidity level. The problem is if it's cold enough, not enough water evaporates, and so the pump keeps pumping water on the inside, which can then flood the incubator. And that almost happened to us. We caught it, and that was happening towards the end, and we actually had to turn off the pump to prevent it from constantly pumping water into the incubator. The incubator was already full to the rim with water, right below the grid where the eggs were laying during the last stage of hatching. And so fortunately, we caught that, turned it off, and we had slightly lower humidity levels than what was ideal, but it worked out really well. In fact, from the 24 eggs we put into the incubator, 1 wasn't fertile, 2 didn't make it, 1 had a very small embryo. We cracked it open later, and it didn't, it never developed past the first few days of, maybe it was an old egg, I don't know. And 1 had a fairly large embryo, but still it must have died off around day 10 or so, and it didn't make it. But out of the 24 eggs, 21 made it. Again, 1 wasn't fertile and 2 didn't further develop. So we had a fairly high hatching rate, even despite the slightly lower humidity levels. So that's important. The other thing is, you need to adjust settings for the different stages of the incubation. And if you fail to do that, you might also run into issues. So for example, towards the end, I think you decrease the temperature a little bit and you change the humidity levels. So we did that once during the incubation process at day 18 out of 21. The last, the hatching stage, the last 3 days, we changed the settings to make sure they are ideal for the type of eggs, in our case chicken eggs, that we wanted to hatch. And that's important. So if the humidity is, for example, too high during the last phase during the hatching phase, then the chick might have issues breaking through the shell. And so again, that's important, and I encourage you to read the manual of your incubator before starting. I read it 3 times to make sure I fully understood what was going on during these different types of hatching. Now, one big mistake that we didn't make that mistake, but we I think could have done things even better, is overhandling the eggs. There is nothing more exciting if you incubate for the first time than to candle the eggs, to shine a bright light onto the eggs and to try to see what's happening on the inside, if the embryo is developing, if you can see the blood vessels, etc. And our incubator suggested doing the candling 3 times during the entire 21-day incubation process. I think the first one was at day 8, then at day 11, and at day 18. So right when the hatching period would start. And to be truthful, the candling on day 8 and 11 were probably entirely useless, because you see what you need to see to make a proper decision if the egg developed or not at day 18. candling it before to remove the ones that you think are not developing is a waste of time, because nothing bad's going to happen if those eggs stay inside the incubator until the end. The bad thing that happens is every time you lift the lid and you take out an egg, all the humidity is gone, the temperature is gone, and you introduce fluctuations in both humidity and temperature, and that can negatively impact the hatching rate and cause issues that you don't need. There is no value, as far as I'm concerned, in candling the eggs 3 times during the incubation process. Next time we incubate, we do it 1 time. Honestly, we might not even do it at all, because you'll see then on day 21, ours started hatching actually on day 20 and then got into day 21. You see what hatches. We waited an extra day to see if any stragglers would come out. And once we noticed that there was nothing going on anymore, we cracked those 3 eggs open. Actually, 1 we already took out on day 18. But the other 2, we just waited. We cracked them open. Then once everyone else had hatched, and we saw there was, nothing going on in there. So I think the candling is overrated. I know it's exciting. I know it's very, very enticing to kind of open the incubator and look, but I would highly recommend don't do it. Just leave it closed at least until day 18, or just wait until they hatched and then wait another day, because they are supposed to stay, once the chicks have hatched, stay in there anyway, completely dry off, to fluff up. They don't need any food or water at this point. They have the egg yolk that can last them for up to 72 hours without feed or water. So you're in no rush in letting them completely dry out, letting everyone hatch, and then taking them all out at the same time. There is no issue with that. And the last factor, or the last mistake that fortunately we haven't made, but we ran into in the past with our brooder, is to not plan for power failures. Depending on where you live in this country, there is a high probability that at some point during the year you lose power. And it might be for a couple of hours, it might be for a couple of days, or it might be even longer. And obviously, if that happens while you're incubating and suddenly the heat drops, the humidity drops, you probably lose all of your eggs. So I highly recommend investing in a uninterruptible power supply. It can be something as a desktop unit that you might use for a computer, that keeps the incubator going at least for a couple of hours if the power goes out. Now, fortunately, we have solar panels with battery backup that can last us for at least a day. So and we had power outages over the last couple of weeks that just lasted for a few minutes, but nonetheless, we were covered. We didn't even notice because we were immediately on battery power. So that's something I would also recommend to invest in, to have handy, so that if you have a minor power outage, you're not going to lose all your eggs and have to start over again. I hope those tips or those insights were useful. Don't make those mistakes. Try to avoid them. Try plan ahead. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If not, let me know what you could have done better. Subscribe, and I hope I'll see you next time.